Hello, my name is Felix Prose, and today I'm going to be talking about the importance of local news. Local news. Who is local news? Well, an example of who local news would be is a up-and-coming journalist in your community who would publish their articles in something like the now defunct town pages that we used to have. What is local news? Well, local news is news. Local news is just reports on stuff that happens within, local communities and what's going on. Where does local news happen? In smaller communities. When does local news happen? Well, when a city, municipality, or town is voting on whether or not to replace an intersection with a roundabout, or if they want to have the public vote on a tax levy for a school, that's when a local news station would report on something like that. Why does local news happen? So that the people living within those towns and cities have a voice in the decisions that occur within their towns and cities. Local news serves the purpose of informing the public and allowing the public to interact with local government. They're kind of like a middleman. And when it comes to local news, how does local news happen? Well, local news, when it did happen, not so much anymore as it's experienced a decline, served a very important purpose that was keeping local government in check by reporting on the events that would occur inside local communities. And a brief recent history of local news in the 21st century. In Australia, 92 local news stations have switched to online only publication because they've essentially failed to sell physical copies to people within their own communities. And as a whole, over 100 news publications have shut down between 2008 and 2018 in Australia. Now I understand that this information is from Australia, and I actually got this information from an article called Democracy Dies a Little When Local News is Gagged, and it's from the Sydney Morning Herald. But it's relevant information, and it goes on to my next point about why local news is on the decline. Now, why is local news on the decline? Well, it's not relevant. Local news no longer serves a purpose because no one reads it anymore. And originally, local news did have goals like holding local government accountable for the decisions that they make, and they used to act really assertive. But now, because no one reads local news anymore, a lot of local governments put question limits on their local press and purposely give these institutions long response times. Local press is not taken seriously, and most of the time, government officials just ignore their requests. And because of this, they have nothing to report on, and this has kind of created a positive feedback loop within local news communities because the local governments won't reply to their questions, so they have nothing to report on, so that no one will read their news. Then local government doesn't take them seriously and then doesn't answer their questions, and so on and so forth. And along with that, misguided goals. A lot of local papers used to be a mile wide and an inch deep in terms of what content they would cover. A lot of their reporting was mundane and didn't have any watchdog journalism. Okay, reporting about some parade that happened in another state is not relevant. Okay, and while a movie review can stimulate, a local business such as a movie theater by encouraging people to go and visit it, it's not it doesn't fit into the bigger picture, you know. Um And failure to change was another big issue. A lot of local papers failed to utilize the internet and usually just copy pasted their articles online, just expecting people to consume it. And, while local news didn't succeed with having a lot of diverse stories, they weren't getting their messages out there or making a difference because no one really consumed the content anymore because, as people grew older, their readership died off. You don't really see a lot of younger people looking at local news because it's not relevant anymore. Okay, relevant experience. What has local news done in my life? Nothing. I haven't bothered to read the town pages once and now they're defunct. Why didn't I read them? Because they weren't relevant. The town pages didn't report on anything that I cared about. Okay, if I'm gonna read local news, I want to learn about like tax levies, city parks, yeah, parks and recreation. That's something that I think a lot of people care about. I want to learn about the facilities that I can use for my enjoyment that are provided to me by my local government. But, you know, just using the town pages as an example, they didn't really hit on that very much. They reported on people's achievements, but not like stuff that matters, that like tax money goes to. And that's what a lot of people care about. And when we look at important events, if we look at the past, I already talked about why local news died. It failed to adapt, generational disconnect. It had too much of a broad reach instead of just focusing on stuff like municipal events or what city councils would vote on. Its messaging was ineffective and it was unmarketable to most companies because no one would read it. And a lot of these companies focused on short term gain over long term gain. And I got this actually from The Decline of Local News, dissected by a newspaper veteran, which is written by Tracy Mark, and it's from the New York Times. And he discussed basically what I described in this slide and the last in terms of what has been happening with local news. But I guess looking forward, if you ask the question, is there a future for local news? I would argue yes. I read an article by PR Newswire called Announcing IndieGraph, a network of journalist entrepreneurs making it easier to launch digital news outlets. And what IndieGraph basically is an online resource sharing software that's specifically targeted towards local news sources. And basically, it's a collaboration platform where local news outlets and their respective journalists can work with each other on their marketing techniques and how to get their news stories out there to their target audience. And also at the same time, Google and Facebook are trying to fill the void left by the death of a lot of local news organizations by giving additional advertising credits to journalists to help their online communities grow on their platforms. The reason being that if they grow their community on their website, they're going to make more money off of ad revenue. Did local news have a conflict? Yes, it did, against its communities and its readership. Because local news wasn't taken seriously anymore, this is also from the Sydney Morning Herald. I'm pretty sure I mentioned this earlier, but well, I'm gonna mention this specifically. There is a city in Australia, I forgot what its name was, but they put a two-question limit for every journalist that would show up to the city council meetings, and for a lot of the stores specifically within that community, they would place a 2 week waiting time on questions that the press, well, local press would ask. My bad. And yeah, no one cared to read it anymore. And as a result, local business and government stopped taking local press seriously. That's a typo. Okay, ignore that. Did this have a lasting impact? Yes, it had. It has had a lasting impact because local news has been on a decline for years. Citizens have lost a voice of criticism against the leaders in their community. Because local news isn't really a force that reports on anything anymore, because a lot of local news stations have died, no one there's nothing to counteract the actions of local government. They can just slap an intersection down wherever they want to, and there's no one really there to oppose it. Local news stations served as kind of a gathering place for the opinions of members of various communities, where they could write down their concerns and have other members of the community read them as well. And this is covered by that article that I mentioned from the Sydney Morning Herald. But yeah, and I drew that little comic there because, you know, I mean, I guess in Rosemount, most of these school tax levies are already rejected. But, I feel like there might possibly be a disconnect between the citizenry and the administrations, because they reject these tax levies, but I don't think they know why. Um, Novelty and usefulness are the two aspects of journalism that local news really go over, because, local news is always unique because it always serves a unique community. No community's alike, you don't see the same people in the same community. And, with local news, it serves specific people have specific problems. Local news is always going to have a niche in that it fits into. Local news serves the goal of informing the community about local events and keeps housing associations and small government in check. And I went over this earlier. The first half of this mini paragraph being novelty, the second half being usefulness. And when it comes to journalism as a whole, you know, the audience gets informed. Both local and national news companies, they have their own purposes. Local news stations cover what matters to local communities. They cover what happens, they cover what's going on. If there's going to be a new sheriff in town, if there's going to be a new intersection, the school needs a tax levy, if there's going to be a new park, what fish is going to get stocked in the DNR or by the DNR, not in um, national news confronts big league political figures on issues that matter to the country as a whole. Local news has a purpose in confronting small issues that affect smaller communities. That's why it exists. And this is my works cited. And as one final note, if this seemed to drag on for a while, I'm in horrible pain. I just had my wisdom teeth removed, and I can barely speak. I vomited 8 times in the past 10 hours. Yeah, it's not cool. Have a good night.